Middle-earth holds more than mountains and rivers. It carries the echoes of forgotten ages. I am your keeper of ancient knowledge, sharing the deeper lore that illuminates even the darkest mysteries. Welcome to the Untold Stories.
In the days when shadow first crept long across the plains of Rohan, when the wind bore whispers of unease from the southern borders, and the horses grew restless in their stables, there dwelt in the golden halls of Edoras one whose heart harbored a tempest fiercer than any storm that swept down from the White Mountains. Éowyn was her name, daughter of Éowyn, sister to Éomer the Bold, and ward to Theoden King. Yet in the deepening twilight of those troubled years, she felt herself more prisoner than princess in the house of her fathers. The great hall of Meduseld stood as it had for countless generations, its golden roof catching the last light of each dying day, its pillars carved with the deeds of kings long past the halls of waiting. Yet now a shadow lay upon that brightness, subtle as spider's silk yet strong as iron chains. It crept through the corridors like mist, settling in corners where laughter once rang, pooling in the spaces between words unspoken. The king sat often silent upon his throne, his gaze turned inward to places none could follow, and his voice, when it came, seemed to echo from some distant, darker realm. Éowyn moved through these halls like a caged eagle, her steps echoing in chambers grown too quiet, her eyes seeking always the horizon beyond the great doors that seemed to beckon, yet remain forever barred to her. In the early morning, when mist clung to the grasslands and the sun was but a promise in the eastern sky, she would stand upon the high terrace and watch the Rohirrim ride out on their daily patrols. Éomer among them, tall and proud in his saddle, his spear catching the first gleam of dawn. How her heart yearned to follow, to feel the wind of the mark in her hair and the thunder of hoofbeats beneath her, to ride toward whatever darkness gathered beyond the borders of their realm and meet it with blade in hand. But always the same words echoed in her memory, spoken in the deep voice of her uncle, weighted with the authority of kings. Your place is here, niece. The women of the Golden Hall do not ride to war. And so she remained, tending to the needs of a house grown strange and sorrowful, watching shadows lengthen where once all had been light, feeling the slow poison of helplessness seep into her bones like winter cold. Yet in these darkening days, when hope seemed as distant as the mountains of Gondor and the very air grew thick with foreboding, there stirred within her something that no shadow could touch. A flame kindled in the forge of her ancestors' courage, fed by the wind of the plains and the proud neighing of horses, nurtured by the ancient songs of valor that still echoed in the rafters of Meduseld when the minstrels played. It was a fire that would not be quenched by silence or dimmed by the gathering dark, though she knew not yet how bright it would burn when the hour of testing came. The servants whispered now in corners, their voices low and troubled. They spoke of ill dreams that plagued the king, of words half heard in empty chambers, of a presence that walked the halls when all should be sleeping. Some named it grief for the losses that had befallen the house, for Éowyn fallen in battle, for the queen taken by sickness, for the slow diminishing of all things bright and fair. But Éowyn, with the keen sight that comes to those who watch and wait in silence, saw deeper than servants' tales. She saw in her uncle's clouded eyes the reflection of a will not his own, heard in his hesitant speech the echo of whispers from afar. The shadow that lay upon Meduseld had a name, though none dared speak it aloud in the halls of the Horse Lords. And so the days passed, each one darker than the last, and Éowyn waited in her cage of gold and tradition, her heart a forge where steel was slowly taking shape. It was on the 7th day of Thrimage, when the first flowers of summer should have bloomed bright in the meadows below Edoras. That word came from the borders like a shadow bird, bearing ill tidings. The messenger rode hard from the southern eaves, his horse foam-flecked and wild-eyed, and in his face was written the tale of things that should not be. He spoke in the council chamber of trees that walked in the darkness beyond the Entwash, of voices heard calling from empty glades, and of horses found wandering riderless, with terror frozen in their eyes. Éowyn stood behind the great pillar where the women of the house were permitted to listen, her fingers pressed white against the carved stone as the words fell like hammer blows upon her heart. For she knew the southern borders as well as any rider of the mark. Had she not spent countless hours in her youth exploring every dell and stream when her father yet lived? The messenger spoke of Fangorn's Edge, where the ancient wood pressed close against the grasslands, and of shadows moving where no shadows should fall in the bright hours of day. "The Ent's wake," whispered old Harmer, captain of the guard, his weathered face grave with memory. "In the days of my grandfather's grandfather, such tales were told, of the shepherds of the trees stirring when great evil threatened the world. But long have they slept, long have they been silent as stone." Theoden King sat hunched upon his throne, his fingers trembling upon the carved arms, and when he spoke his voice seemed to come from far away, as if he looked upon visions none other could see. "Trees, yes, the trees remember. They remember when the world was younger, when the woods stretched far and the darkness had not yet learned to whisper in the minds of men. But what stirs them now? What enemy comes that even the oldest things upon Middle-earth take counsel in the shadows?" But no answer came, save the wind that moaned through the high windows of Meduseld, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something that made the horses in the stables stamp and whinny with unease, something that spoke of changes beyond the rim of mortal sight. That night, when the household slept and the moon rode high and cold above the barrowfield, Éowyn walked in the gardens behind the hall. Sleep had fled from her like a startled bird, driven away by dreams of trees with eyes of amber flame and voices that sang in languages older than the tongues of men. The night air was sweet with the fragrance of Pelennor and Nifredil, flowers her mother had planted in the days when joy still dwelt in the Golden Hall. Yet even their beauty could not lift the weight that pressed upon her spirit. She found herself drawn to the southern wall, where the stones were oldest and worn smooth by countless seasons of wind and rain. Here, in the shadow of the guard tower, she could look out across the folder toward the dark line of Fangorn, visible even in the starlight as a deeper darkness against the horizon. And as she watched, it seemed to her that the forest stirred, not with the movement of wind in branches, but with something far more ancient and purposeful, as if the very earth beneath the trees had awakened from long slumber and begun to remember its strength. A sound came to her then, borne on the night wind, faint as a whisper, yet clear as the call of horns in the distance. It was not quite song, nor quite speech, but something between them both, rising and falling like the voices of many waters joined in harmony. The horses heard it too, for from the stables came the sound of restless hoofbeats and soft nickering, as if they sensed the presence of kindred spirits moving in the darkness far away. "They wake indeed," she murmured to the night, her voice barely more than a breath. "The Ents remember their purpose, and the trees take counsel in the shadow of coming war. Would that I might do the same? Would that I might wake from this dream of helplessness and remember what strength lies sleeping in the blood of Eorl the Young." And in that moment, standing beneath the stars with the ancient song of Fangorn in her ears, Éowyn felt something stir within her heart. Not the restless fire that had burned there through the dark days of waiting, but something cooler and deeper, like the first touch of dawn upon the mountains. It was the beginning of understanding, the first glimpse of a path that would lead her from the shadows of despair toward a destiny she could not yet imagine. The trees remembered. Perhaps it was time for the daughters of the Horse Lords to remember as well. In the grey hour before dawn, when mist clung to the hollow places of the mark and the world lay hushed beneath the dying stars, Éomer son of Éowyn rode forth from the gates of Edoras. His company was small, 12 picked riders of his Eord, men tested in border skirmishes and wise in the ways of the wild lands. Yet in his heart he bore a burden heavier than mail, a weight of foreboding that had grown with each passing day since the strange tidings came from the southern marches. Firefoot, his great bay stallion, stepped eager and proud beneath him, nostrils flaring at the scents carried on the morning wind. The horse had been restless through the night, pacing in his stall as if he too sensed the wrongness that crept like poison through the air of Rohan. Now, released at last from the confines of stable and courtyard, he stretched his legs in the rhythm that had been bred into his bones through countless generations. The long, ground-eating stride that could carry a rider of the mark from the Eisen to the Entwash, between sunrise and sunset. Behind them, Edoras faded into the mist, like a golden dream half-remembered, its halls and towers becoming one with the rolling hills that cradled them. Yet Éomer carried with him the image of his sister's face, pale and drawn in the light of the guttering torches, watching from the high window as he led his company through the gates. In her eyes he had seen the same hunger that gnawed at his own heart, the desperate need to ride toward danger rather than wait for it to come creeping to their threshold. But where he could answer the call of duty and the open road, she remained caged by custom and the failing will of their king. The land through which they rode bore the scars of a cruel spring. The grass, which should have grown thick and green with the warming of the earth, lay thin and pale in many places, as if some blight had touched it in the dark hours before dawn. Streams that had run clear and cold since the days of yore now flowed murky and strange, carrying upon their waters the taste of fear and the shadow of things better left unnamed. Even the very air seemed changed, heavy with portents that made the horses toss their heads and shy at shadows that held nothing more than wind. They rode in silence for the most part, these grim-faced sons of the Eorlingers, their eyes scanning the horizon for signs of the enemy they could not name. Yet as the sun climbed higher and the mist began to burn away from the grasslands, Éomer found his thoughts turning ever southward, toward the dark line of Fangorn that marked the edge of the known world. What forces stirred in those ancient depths? What counsel did the trees take in their deep halls beneath the earth? And what answer would they give to the shadow that reached out from distant Mordor? At midday they came to the ford of the Snowbourn, where the river ran swift and clear over stones worn smooth by countless ages. Here Éomer called a halt, and his men dismounted to water their horses and take what rest they could before the long ride to the Entwash. It was a place he knew well from the days of his youth, when he and Éowyn would ride here with their father, learning the arts of woodcraft and the secret ways of the borderlands. How bright the world had seemed then, how simple the choices between right and wrong, light and shadow. But as he knelt beside the running water to drink, Éomer saw reflected in its surface not the face of the eager young rider he had been, but that of a man grown hard and watchful, marked by loss and the weight of responsibility. The years had carved lines around his eyes, and in their depths burned a flame that spoke of battles fought and comrades fallen, of choices made in the heat of desperate hours when the fate of kingdoms hung upon the edge of a sword. Marshal, called Elfhelm, his lieutenant, pointing toward the southern sky. Look you there. Éomer raised his eyes to follow the pointing finger, and felt his heart grow cold within him. Far off, above the distant trees of Fangorn, a great cloud was rising, not the white plume of morning mist, but something darker and more ominous, shot through with threads of fire that flickered and danced like lightning trapped in storm rack. It spread as they watched, reaching out with tendrils of shadow that seemed to grasp at the very heavens, and from its depths came a sound like distant thunder, or the groaning of the earth itself. "The trees wake," whispered Elfhelm, his weathered face pale with wonder and fear. "And they are not pleased." Éowyn nodded grimly, his hand moving unbidden to the hilt of Guthwinir, his sword. "Then let us ride to meet whatever comes. Better to face darkness in the open field than wait for it to find us cowering behind stone walls." He turned to his men, seeing in their faces the same mixture of fear and resolve that burned in his own heart. "Mount up, riders of the mark. We have promises to keep and miles to go before we sleep." And so they rode on, 12 warriors of Rohan and their marshal, into the teeth of whatever storm was brewing in the deep places of the world. While Éowyn rode toward the borders and the ancient troubles of Fangorn, in the halls of Meduseld a different darkness gathered strength. It came not with the thunder of hoofbeats or the clash of steel, but in whispers that slithered through the corridors like serpents, in words spoken softly beside the throne when shadows grew long and the king's mind wandered in paths better left untrodden. Grimmer, son of Galmod, moved through the golden hall like smoke, his pale eyes watching, his thin lips speaking counsel that fell upon Theoden's ears like drops of poison sweetened with false concern. Éowyn had come to know the sound of his footsteps, soft and careful, like those of a man who walks where he is not wanted, yet cannot be turned away. She would hear them in the deep hours of night, padding through the passages toward the king's chambers, and in the morning Theoden would emerge more bent than before, his gaze more distant, his voice more uncertain when the business of the realm required his attention. The councillors spoke in hushed tones of the king's declining health, of grief that had taken root in his heart like a wasting sickness. But Éowyn saw deeper than their surface concerns. On this day, as storm clouds gathered above the misty mountains, and the wind carried strange scents from the west, she stood in the shadow of the great stair and watched as Wormtongue bent low beside her uncle's chair. His voice was too soft for her to catch the words, but she saw how Theoden's shoulders sagged beneath their weight, how his fingers trembled as they gripped the carved arms of his throne. And in that moment, as if some dark veil had been lifted from her sight, she perceived the truth that all others had been blind to see. The shadow that lay upon Meduseld had a name, and its dwelling was not in the far places of the earth, but in the black tower that rose like a talon from the circle of Isengard. Orthanc, the impenetrable, ancient stronghold of the wizard Saruman, stood barely 50 leagues to the west, its dark stone visible from the highest towers of Edoras when the air was clear and the sun stood high. How had she been so blind? How had any of them failed to see the hand that moved their king like a puppet on strings? The voice that spoke through the lips of his counselor? As she watched, Grima's pale eyes turned toward her, and in them she saw a glitter of malice that made her blood run cold. He knew that she watched, knew that she began to understand, and in his smile was a promise of darker days to come. For what was one maiden's suspicion against the slow corruption of years? What could her voice avail against the honeyed poison that had already done its work so well? That evening, when the household gathered for the evening meal, Éowyn took her place at the high table with a heart heavy as stone. The hall that had once rung with laughter and song now echoed with the sparse conversation of men who had forgotten how to hope. Theoden sat silent at the head of the board, his food untouched, his eyes fixed upon visions that none other could share. Beside him, Wormtongue leaned close, speaking words that seemed to flow like dark water, eroding the foundations of will and purpose that had once made the king the strongest of his line. "My lord," she heard him say, his voice soft yet carrying clearly in the hushed hall. The reports from the borders grow ever more troubling. Perhaps it were wise to call back the Eorids, to gather our strength here in Edoras, where it can be properly defended. The wide plains offer too many ways for enemies to approach unseen. And Theoden nodded slowly, as if the words made sense, though any child of the Mark could have told him that the strength of Rohan lay not in hiding behind walls, but in the speed of their horses and the courage of their riders. Éowyn felt her hands clench beneath the table, felt the fire that had smoldered so long in her heart begin to burn with a fiercer flame. How long would this continue? How long would they sit idle while the realm crumbled around them, ruled by fear and false counsel? Later, when the hall had emptied and the servants had cleared away the remains of the joyless feast, she walked alone to the great doors and stood looking out into the night. The wind had risen, and in its voice she heard echoes of the wild strength that had once defined her people. Somewhere to the south, Éomer rode through the darkness, seeking answers to questions that grew more urgent with each passing hour. Somewhere to the west, in the black circle of Isengard, a power older and more subtle than any orc horde spun webs of deceit that reached even into the heart of the Golden Hall. But here, in this place that should have been the bright center of the Mark's strength, she stood trapped and helpless, watching the slow strangulation of all that she held dear. The iron of her ancestors' courage sang in her blood. The wind of the plains called to her from beyond the walls, yet still she remained, bound by duty, by custom, by the chains that others had forged for her in the name of protection and propriety. "Not much longer," she whispered to the wind and the stars. "Not much longer can this endure, for even the strongest dam must break when the waters rise too high, and the fire that burned within her would not be contained forever." 3 days' hard riding had brought Éomer and his company to the edge of the known world, where the grasslands of Rohan gave way to the dark eaves of Fangorn, and the air grew thick with the weight of ancient watching. Here, in a fold of the hills, where a stream ran down from the mountains to lose itself in the forest depths, stood the ruins of Halifirion's sister, a watchtower of the elder days whose name had been forgotten even by the Lawmaster's songs. The stones lay tumbled and moss-grown, yet still they held something of their old majesty, rising from the earth like the bones of some great beast that had lain down to die in the green wilderness. It was Elfhelm who first remarked upon the silence, not the natural quiet of deep woods or sleeping water, but something that pressed against the ears like a held breath, as if the very air had been drained of all sound save the beating of their own hearts. The horses felt it too. Firefoot and his companions stood, with ears pricked forward and nostrils wide, their eyes rolling white as they scented something that spoke to the deep memory of their kind, something that whispered of days when the world was darker and stranger than mortal minds could easily bear. "We should not have come here," murmured Fastred, youngest of the company, his voice barely above a whisper, yet seeming to echo strangely in the hushed air. "The horses know it, Marshal. This is not a place for the living." But Éomer, though he felt the same chill that touched his men's hearts, urged Firefoot forward toward the broken archway that had once been the tower's gate. For had they not ridden forth to seek answers to the riddles that plagued their land? And here, in this place where old stone met older wood, where the works of men crumbled beneath the patient gaze of trees that remembered the first stirring of stars, surely some truth might be found, though it be a truth that cut like winter wind and brought no comfort to those who learned it. The ruins received them in silence deeper than the depths of barrows, a quiet so profound that it seemed to swallow their footsteps and the creak of leather, the jingle of mail and bit. Within the broken walls, fragments of ancient carvings could still be discerned, horses running beneath stars that were not those that shone in the current age, riders bearing spears against enemies whose shapes had been worn away by time and weather. But there was something else as well, something that made Éomer's hand move unbidden to his sword hilt, though no living foe stood before him. The stones themselves seemed wrong. Not merely old, but tainted, as if some corruption had seeped into their very substance during the long years of their abandonment. Where moss should have grown green and clean, it showed a sickly yellow-brown, and the water that pooled in the broken foundations held an oily sheen that reflected no light, though the sun still shone overhead. A smell hung in the air, faint yet persistent, the reek of things that had died badly and been left to rot in hidden places, mixed with something sharper and more metallic that made the horses snort and paw the ground with growing unease. In the center of what had once been the tower's great hall, Éowyn found what he had come seeking, though he wished with all his heart that he had not. A well opened in the floor, its rim carved with runes in the ancient tongue of the Northmen, and from its depths rose a darkness that was more than mere absence of light. It was the darkness of the void between stars, of spaces where no wholesome thing had ever dwelt, of the deep places beneath the world where the servants of the shadow had delved their first halls in the youth of ardor. As he knelt beside the well's rim, straining to read the worn inscriptions, a sound rose from its depths, not quite voice, not quite wind, but something that spoke to the fear that dwelt in the deepest corners of mortal hearts. It spoke of watching eyes in the dark beneath, of things that had once served the Dark Lord in the elder days, and now stirred once more as their master's power grew in the far places of the world. It spoke of poisoned streams and blighted lands, of the slow corruption that would spread from this place and others like it, until all the green world lay under shadow. "Marshal," called Elfhelm, his voice tight with strain, "we should leave this place. The very air grows heavy with malice, and the horses will not suffer this presence much longer." Éowyn rose slowly from his crouch beside the well, his face pale but set with grim determination. He had found his answer, though it was not one he could bear to any hall with joy. The shadow that reached toward Rohan came not merely from Orthanc or the far darkness of Mordor, but from the very bones of the earth itself, from places where evil had taken root in ages past and now stirred to wakefulness as the Dark Lord's power waxed strong once more. "We ride," he said simply, turning his back upon the cursed well and the ruins that sheltered it. "We ride, and we carry word to all who will listen. The old evils wake, and the time of easy peace is done." Behind them, as they spurred their horses from that accursed place, the ruins settled back into their ancient silence, keeping their vigil over secrets that were old when the fathers of the Rohirrim first came down from the north. In the deep hours after midnight, when the Golden Hall lay wrapped in the embrace of dreams and the guards dozed at their posts, Éowyn woke to the sound of voices speaking in the chamber below her own. Sleep had been elusive, filled with visions of burning towers and horses running wild beneath a starless sky, and she rose from her bed like one still caught in the web of nightmare. The voices drifted up through the ancient stones, low, urgent words that spoke of matters that should not be discussed in the halls of kings. Barefoot and silent as a hunting cat, she crept to the floor and pressed her ear to the carved planks. Below lay her uncle's private chamber, the place where he retreated when the weight of kingship grew too heavy for his failing shoulders. But it was not Theoden's voice she heard speaking in the darkness. It was the sibilant whisper of Grima Wormtongue, and his words fell upon her ears like drops of venom from a serpent's fang. "The time grows short, my lord," came the counselor's voice, thick with false concern. "The reports from the borders confirm what we have long feared. Enemies gather on all sides, and your people cry out for strong leadership. Yet see how your strength fails you, how the burden of years weighs upon your shoulders, like armor grown too heavy to bear." And then came her uncle's voice, but so changed from the proud tones of the king, she remembered that her heart clenched with grief and rage. It was the voice of an old man speaking from the depths of a terrible dream, hollow and uncertain, as if he no longer trusted his own thoughts or memories. Yes, yes, the weight grows heavier each day. I can scarce remember. Was it yesterday that Éowyn fell in battle? Or have years passed? The faces blur together, the voices fade. Only your counsel remains clear, old friend. What would you have me do? Rest, my lord. Let others bear the burden for a while. Your nephew rides to folly in the south, chasing shadows while real enemies mass in the north and west. Call him back before his pride leads the Aeord to destruction. Gather your people close. Trust in the strength of stone walls, rather than the wild galloping of horses across the grasslands. There is wisdom in caution, safety in withdrawal. Éowyn felt her blood turn to ice in her veins as she heard the poison dripping from those honeyed words. Withdraw the Eorids, abandon the borders that her people had guarded for 500 years. It was the Council of Cowardice dressed in the garb of prudence, the voice of defeat whispering in the ear of a king whose mind had been clouded by arts that belonged to no wholesome power. But worse was yet to come, for Grima's voice dropped to a whisper so low she had to strain to catch the words, and in them she heard the truth that explained all the mysteries that had plagued her through the dark months of her uncle's decline. The White Wizard sends his greetings, my lord. His tower is strong, his knowledge vast, and his friendship worth more than the alliance of lesser powers. He has marked your wisdom in these dark times, your willingness to listen to reason rather than the hot blood of youth. When the storm breaks, and break it surely will, Isengard will remember those who chose the path of prudence. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Theoden's labored breathing, and when he spoke again, his voice was that of a man speaking from the bottom of a deep well, lost and alone and grasping at any hand that offered aid. Saruman. Yes, Saruman the Wise. His counsel has ever been sound, his friendship valuable. But why do I feel so cold, Grima? Why do the faces of my kinfolk seem strange to me, as if I look upon them through dark water? Why does my own voice sound like the echo of a stranger's words? Age, my lord, nothing more than age and the weight of sorrows. Rest now, and let those who love you bear the burden of decision. All will be well, you will see. All will be as Saruman, as wisdom, as peace requires. Éowyn pulled back from the floor as if it had burned her, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Now she understood the full scope of the trap that had been laid around her uncle, the subtle sorcery that bound him more surely than any chain of iron. Saruman the Wise, Saruman the Betrayer, had reached out from his black tower and claimed the King of Rohan for his own, speaking through the lips of his creature, while the real Theoden drifted like a ghost through his own halls. The truth was terrible beyond her worst fears, yet it also brought with it a strange relief. For now she knew the name of her enemy, knew the source of the shadow that had fallen upon her house. And knowledge, even terrible knowledge, was the first step toward freedom. But what could one woman do against the power of a wizard, against sorcery that could steal the very mind from a king's head and leave only a hollow shell behind? What strength could she summon to break chains that had been forged in the fires of Isengard and tempered with years of patient corruption? Standing there in the darkness of her chamber, listening to the murmur of voices below as Grima continued his work of slow destruction, Éowyn felt the fire in her heart burn brighter than it ever had before. For she was not merely one woman. She was the daughter of warriors, the niece of kings, the heir to 5 centuries of courage that no shadow could wholly quench. The time for waiting was almost done. Sleep, when it finally came to Éowyn in the grey hours before dawn, brought not rest, but visions that burned behind her closed eyes like brands of fire. She found herself standing upon a vast plain beneath a sky the colour of old blood, where no grass grew and no bird sang, where the very air tasted of ash and the dreams of the dead. In the distance, mountains rose like broken teeth against the horizon, and from their peaks came a light that was not light, a red glow that spoke of forges burning in the depths of the earth, of iron being shaped for purposes that served no wholesome end. Before her stretched a road paved with stones that might once have been white, but now gleamed dull and grey, stained with the passage of countless feet, some shod, some bare, some that left prints which belonged to no creature that walked in the waking world. Along this road moved shapes that hurt to look upon directly, armies marching in perfect silence toward destinations known only to the will that drove them. Orcs from the mountains, wolves from the wild lands, and things that had once been men, but were men no longer, their faces hidden beneath helms of black iron, and their eyes burning with fires that had been kindled in the deep places of despair. But it was not the armies that filled her heart with dread. It was the tower that rose beyond them all, a spike of darkness that seemed to pierce the very dome of heaven. Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, fortress of the one whose name was spoken only in whispers, whose very existence was a wound in the fabric of the world. From its highest pinnacle, where no light of sun or moon could reach, a presence watched and waited, patient as stone, yet hungry as the flame that devours all it touches. And as she stood transfixed upon that desolate plain, feeling smaller than a grain of sand before the immensity of that malevolent gaze, a voice spoke in her mind, not in words that the ear could hear, but in thoughts that burned like acid in the chambers of memory. It was the voice of the necromancer, the Lord of the Rings, the Shadow of the East, and it spoke to her across the gulf of dreams with terrible clarity. See how small your struggles are, daughter of the Mark. See how brief the flame of your defiance burns before the darkness that has endured since the first rising of the sun. Your king sleeps in the web I have spun. Your riders gallop toward their doom. Your golden halls shall be ash before the winter comes again. What are you but a candle in a hurricane, a single note of music drowned in the thunder of my wrath? The voice pressed against her spirit like a weight of iron, seeking to crush all hope, all memory of light and laughter, and the clean wind of the grasslands. She felt her knees buckle beneath the assault, felt her breath catch in her throat as visions of defeat and despair flooded through her mind. She saw Edoras, burning, its golden roof blackened and broken. She saw the Pelennor fields carpeted with the bodies of the slain, and among them the faces of all those she loved. Éomer with his bright sword broken in his hand, Theoden fallen from his horse, with the light faded forever from his eyes. I have waited long for this hour, the voice continued, terrible in its patience, inexorable as the turning of the world. Through the long years I have prepared, sending out my thoughts like fishing lines cast into dark waters, drawing to myself all those who hunger for power over others. Saruman believes himself my ally, but he is merely another tool in my hand. As your king is a tool in his, the web spreads ever wider, and soon all Middle-earth shall know my dominion. But even as the darkness pressed close around her, even as the weight of that malevolent will sought to break her spirit like a reed in the wind, something stirred within Éowyn's heart, a flame that had been kindled not in the forges of Barad-dûr, but in the free air of Rohan, fed by the songs of her people, and the memory of horses running wild beneath the open sky. It was small, that flame, barely more than an ember compared to the vast fires of the enemy's wrath. Yet it burned clean and true, and its light could not be quenched by any shadow. I see you clearly now, she whispered into the red darkness of the vision, and her voice was steady, though her body trembled. I see what you are, not a god or a king, but a prisoner in your own tower, bound by the very chains you seek to forge for others. You speak of my smallness, but it is you who huddle in darkness, afraid of the light that burns in even the humblest heart. You may take my king's mind. You may send armies against my people, but you cannot touch the thing that makes us free. The choice to stand against you, no matter the cost. The vision shattered like glass before the force of her defiance, and she woke gasping in her own bed, dawn light streaming through the windows of her chamber. But the memory of that terrible voice lingered, and with it the knowledge that the shadow over Rohan was but a small part of a greater darkness that reached out from the east to claim all the free peoples of the world. Yet she was not afraid, for she had looked into the eye of the enemy and seen it clearly for what it was. Not omnipotent, not unstoppable, but simply the greatest and most persistent of all the bullies that had ever sought to steal the light from the world. And against such things, the songs of her people had always taught there was but one answer: to stand and fight, however small one's strength might seem, however hopeless the odds might appear. The fire that burned within her heart flared brighter, fed by the wind of resolve that no enemy could still. On the 5th day after her vision of the Dark Tower, when the sun stood high above Edoras, yet cast no warmth upon the stones of Meduseld, a strange sight appeared upon the Bay Madiri road from the west. 3 riders approached the gates, 2 tall men whose faces bore the weathering of long roads and longer sorrows, and between them one who sat his horse like winter itself given form, clad in robes that caught the light like fresh snow beneath the morning sun. Even from the high windows of the Golden Hall, where she watched with growing wonder, Éowyn could feel the power that radiated from that central figure. Not the cold malice that had reached out from Isengard, but something clean and fierce as the lightning that splits the summer sky. Word spread swiftly through the hall that strangers sought audience with the king, and she saw how Grima's face paled as he looked upon the approaching company. There was fear in his pale eyes, not the healthy caution of a man who serves his lord faithfully, but the terror of one whose dark deeds are about to be brought into the light. He scurried about like a rat in a burning granary, whispering urgent words to the guards, seeking to bar the doors against the visitors who rode beneath no banner, save the authority of their own presence. But when the White Wizard dismounted at the threshold of Meduseld and spoke his name, Gandalf Stormcrow, Mithrandir the Grey Pilgrim, who had become something far greater and more terrible, the very stones of the hall seemed to tremble with recognition, for this was he who had walked in shadow and emerged again into light, who had faced the Balrog in the depths of Moria and emerged victorious from the very halls of death. The guards, for all Grima's whispered urgings, could not find the strength to bar his way. "I come to speak with Theoden King," said Gandalf, and his voice carried through the hall like the sound of distant thunder. "I come in the hour of his greatest need, when shadows gather around his throne and false counsel poisons his ear. Let the doorward bar my way if he dares, but know that I shall enter, and the truth shall enter with me." Éowyn watched from the gallery as Wormtongue prostrated himself before her uncle's throne, his words tumbling over one another in desperate haste. "My lord, these strangers come to disturb your rest, to trouble your peace with wild tales and reckless counsel. Send them away, I beg you, before their madness can work harm upon your realm." But Gandalf strode forward through the great hall as if he walked in his own house, and where his feet touched the ancient stones they seemed to brighten, as if the very wood and iron remembered better days. His staff, no longer the simple ash rod he had once carried, but something that seemed wrought of starlight itself, caught and held the fading light that streamed through the high windows, casting rays that drove back shadows which had lurked unnoticed in the corners of the hall. "Theoden, son of Thengel," he said, and his voice was like the wind of the mountains, cold and clean and sharp as steel. "Too long have you sat in shadows? Too long have you listened to whispers that come not from any friend of Rohan? The time has come to wake from this evil dream and take up once more the burden of kingship that was placed upon your shoulders by the choice of your people." And as he spoke, Éowyn saw something she had not witnessed in long months. Her uncle's head rising slowly from his chest, his eyes focusing as if he struggled to remember where he was, who he was meant to be. The fog that had clouded his gaze began to lift like mist before the morning sun, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of the man she remembered from her youth. Strong, wise, terrible in his wrath when his people were threatened. Gandalf, Theoden whispered, the name coming as if drawn from the depths of a deep well. Gandalf Greyheim, but you are changed, white now and terrible to look upon. What has become of me? Why do I feel as one who wakes from a long illness, weak and strange to himself? Because you have been under a spell, Theoden King, Gandalf replied, and now his voice was gentle as summer rain, yet implacable as the turning of the seasons. For too long you have been the puppet of one who calls himself your counselor but serves a master in Isengard. Look upon him now and see him clearly for what he is. He raised his staff, and from its crystal head blazed forth a light that made the torches of the hall seem dim as dying embers. In that radiance, Grimmer Wormtongue was revealed in all his corruption, pale and crawling, his eyes reflecting the light like those of some creature that had lived too long in dark places. He hissed and shrank back from the brightness, but there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run from the truth that blazed forth like the sun emerging from behind storm clouds. Saruman has long had a mind to come here, Gandalf continued, his gaze never leaving Grimmer's cowering form. A mind to replace the king with one more malleable to his will. But I think his will has been overthrown at last, and the rightful ruler of Rohan shall wake to himself once more. The light grew brighter still, and Éowyn felt something shift in the very foundations of the hall. Not in the stones themselves, but in the air, in the subtle currents of will and power that flow between the minds of men. The shadow that had lain upon Medusel like a suffocating blanket was being burned away, and in its place came something she had almost forgotten. Hope, clean and bright as the first star appearing in the evening sky. Out, thundered Theoden, and his voice was like the king's voice she remembered, strong and proud and terrible in its authority. Out, you carrion crow! Take your whispers and your poison counsel, and crawl back to the master who spawned you. And Grimmer fled, scuttling from the hall like the loathsome thing he was, leaving behind only the echo of his fear and the lingering stench of his corruption. But the light remained, growing ever brighter, and in its radiance Éowyn saw her uncle rising from his throne like a man shaking off the chains of a long captivity. The darkness was broken, the fire had come to drive away the shadows, and in her heart another flame leaped high in answer, the flame of her own awakening power. In the hours that followed Grimmer's flight from the Golden Hall, Medusel stirred to life like a hive, whose queen has awakened from a long slumber. Messengers rode out to recall the scattered Eoreds. Horns rang from the watchtowers to summon the lords of the Mark, and in the great hall itself, the sound of purposeful voices replaced the whispered conspiracies that had poisoned the air for so many months. Theoden King sat on his throne, with his back straight and his eyes clear, and those who served him marveled to see the years fall away from his shoulders like a discarded cloak. Yet even as hope kindled in the hearts of the Rohirrim, the tidings that poured in from all quarters spoke of shadows gathering with terrible swiftness. Éomer's riders had returned from the borders with tales that chilled the blood, not only of the corrupted ruins and the ancient evils stirring in their deep places, but of orc hosts moving in the night, of fires burning where no honest hearth should be, of wolves running in packs that spoke with voices almost human in their malice. The time of choosing has come, said Gandalf, standing before the assembled lords with his white robes catching the light like winter snow. No longer can any realm stand alone against the darkness that spreads from Mordor. Saruman has revealed his treachery, and even now his forces mass in Isengard for the assault upon Rohan. Gondor calls for aid. The Shire lies under threat, and all the free peoples must choose. Will they stand together or fall separately into the long night that awaits the conquered? From her place in the gallery, Éowyn watched as pride and doubt warred in the faces of the assembled thanes. Lord Erkenbrand of Westfold spoke first, his weathered features grim with the knowledge of what his scouts had seen along the borders of the gap. 10,000 strong are the forces that gather beneath the walls of Orthanc, he said, and his voice carried the weight of years spent in the defense of the Mark's western marches. Orcs beyond counting, and Uruk-hai bred for war, and wolves from the mountains, and men, yes, men, who have sold their souls for the promise of gold and plunder. How can we stand against such a host? Our riders are brave, but they are few, and the enemy comes with fire and iron to break our defenses. And yet stand we must, replied Gamling the Old, captain of the King's Guard, his grey beard bristling with indignation. For 500 years the House of Yorl has held the mark against all comers. Shall we flee now like foxes before the hunt? Shall we abandon the graves of our fathers and the halls our ancestors built with their own hands? Better to die fighting in the sight of our enemies than to live as beggars in these distant lands. But it was young Lord Deorwin who voiced the doubt that gnawed at many hearts, his face pale with the burden of the choice that lay before them. My king, we have heard the wisdom of Gandalf the White, and none can question his power or his knowledge. Yet he asks us to march to the aid of Gondor when our own realm faces destruction. Would it not be wiser to gather all our strength here in Edoras, to make our stand behind walls that have never fallen to any foe? Theoden listened to all who would speak, his fingers drumming slowly upon the carved arms of his throne as he weighed their words. But Éowyn, watching from her hidden vantage point, could see the fire that burned in his eyes, the same flame that had kindled in her own heart when she defied the voice of the enemy in her vision. She knew, even before he spoke, what his answer would be. "My lords," he said at last, rising from his throne with the fluid grace of a man half his age, "you speak of choices, but in truth there is only one choice before us, the same choice that has faced every generation of the Horse Lords since first we came down from the north. Will we be the people who ride to meet our enemies? Or will we cower behind walls while evil spreads unchecked across the world?" He moved to the great window that looked out over the grasslands of the Mark, and his voice grew soft, yet carried clearly to every corner of the hall. "I have sat too long in shadows, listened too long to the counsel of fear dressed as wisdom. But I am awake now, and I remember what it means to be a king of the Riddermark. Gondor calls for aid, and Rohan will answer. Let Saruman come with all his hosts. We will meet him in the field, and if we must die, we will die as our fathers did, with swords in our hands and songs of victory on our lips." A great shout arose from the assembled lords, the sound of men who had found their courage again and would not be turned from the path of honor. But even as they cheered their king's decision, Arwen felt a cold wind touch her heart. For she alone had seen the true scope of the darkness that gathered against them, had felt the weight of the enemy's malice pressing down upon all the free peoples of the world. They would ride to war, these brave men of Rohan, and many would not return. The thought filled her with a grief so sharp, it was like a blade turned in her breast. Yet beneath the sorrow burned something stronger, a fierce joy that at last the waiting was ended. The time of hiding and hesitation passed. Whatever came, they would meet it with courage. And in her heart, a voice spoke words that surprised her with their clarity. "Let me ride with them. Let me take up spear and sword and prove that the daughters of the Mark are no less brave than its sons." The time for cages, however golden, was done. While the lords of Rohan prepared for the muster that would carry them to war, Gandalf the White walked in the high places above Edoras, his keen eyes turned toward the northern mountains where snow gleamed eternal on the peaks of the misty mountains. The wind that blew from those heights carried more than the scent of stone and glacier. It bore whispers of movement in the deep places, of ancient grudges stirring to wakefulness, of hammers ringing once more in forges that had been cold since the days when Smaug first came to the mountain. "The dwarves remember," he murmured to Aragorn, who walked beside him on the narrow path that wound around the hill of Edoras. In Erebor and the Iron Hills, in the Blue Mountains and the halls beneath the Ered Luin, the sons of Durin take counsel in the deep places. They remember Moria and Azanul-Bizar and all the wrongs that the servants of darkness have worked upon their people. The time comes when even the most cautious of the dwarf lords will see that their mountain fastnesses cannot protect them if all the world falls into shadow. Below them, the Golden Hall blazed in the afternoon light, and from its courtyard came the sound of preparation. The ring of hammer on anvil as weapons were sharpened, the creak of leather as armor was fitted and adjusted, the stamp and whinny of horses being readied for the long roads that lay ahead. Yet for all the urgency of these preparations, there was something more subtle stirring in the air, a sense of awakening that reached far beyond the borders of Rohan, as if the very earth itself had begun to remember its strength. In the armory beneath Meduseld, where the weapons of kings lay wrapped in silk and shadow, Éowyn moved like a ghost among the ancient blades. Here hung Herogrim, her uncle's sword, its edge bright as winter starlight, and its hilt wrapped with wire of gold. Here stood the spears of the Eorlingers, their ash shafts straight as arrows, and their points keen enough to pierce the mail of kings. And here, in a place apart from the weapons of war, lay the arms that had belonged to her father, Éomen's sword and helm, his mail shirt wrought with the device of the white horse, his shield that had borne him through a dozen battles before the orc arrows found him at last on the borders of the Emin Muil. She lifted the sword from its resting place, feeling the balance of the blade in her hands, testing its edge with the careful touch of one who had learned such arts in secret during the long months of her captivity. For though custom decreed that the women of the Golden Hall should know only the peaceful arts of healing and song, Éowyn had never been one to accept such limits. In the dark hours when sleep fled from her like a frightened bird, she had crept to the practice yards where the guards trained, watching from the shadows as they worked through the deadly dance of cut and thrust, parry and riposte. Harma the Dorwood had found her there one night, standing in the moonlight with a wooden practice sword in her hands, moving through the forms she had memorized from countless hours of observation. But instead of the scolding she expected, he had seen something in her face, the same hunger for freedom that burned in the hearts of all his people, the same fierce love of the mark that made strong men willing to die in its defense. "Your father was the finest swordsman of his generation," he had said quietly, stepping out of the shadows where he had watched her practice. He would be proud to see his spirit burning so bright in his daughter's heart. But if you would truly learn the warrior's art, you must have proper teaching, not the half-glimpsed movements of tired guardsmen. And so began her secret education in the arts of war, lessons stolen from the deep hours of night when honest folk slept and only the watchers walked the walls of Edoras. Harma taught her the use of sword and spear, the weight and balance of shield and helm, the 100 small skills that meant the difference between life and death in the press of battle. She learned to move in mail without the ring and clatter that would betray her presence, to strike with the sudden fury of lightning and withdraw before her enemy could recover, to find the weak points in armor that would let her blade drink deep of hostile blood. "You have the gift," Harma told her on the night when she first managed to disarm him in fair combat, sending his practice sword spinning into the darkness. "Not just skill, though that you have earned through honest work, but the warrior's eye, the ability to see the pattern of battle before it unfolds, to know where your enemy will be before he knows it himself. It is a rare thing, rarer still in one so young. Now, standing in the armory with her father's sword in her hands, Éowyn felt the weight of destiny settling upon her shoulders like a mantle wrought of starlight and shadow. Above her, the sounds of preparation continued, men making ready for the ride to Helm's Deep, where they would make their stand against Saruman's host. They rode to war, thinking to defend the women and children left behind in Dunharrow, never knowing that one who had been born to battle burned with impatience in the depths of the Golden Hall. But her time would come. She could feel it in the turning of the wind, in the restless stamp of horses in their stables, in the very stones of Meduseld that had witnessed the deeds of heroes for 500 years. The song of her people spoke of Shieldmaidens who had ridden beside the greatest kings of old, of women whose courage had turned the tide of battles when all seemed lost. Perhaps it was time for such songs to be sung again. In the high places above the city, Gandalf lifted his staff toward the northern peaks, and from its crystal head a light blazed forth. Not the harsh glare of fire, but the clean radiance of the morning star. It was a signal, a call that would be seen by watchers in distant lands, a message that would travel swifter than any horse from the courts of Edoras to the halls of kings in Erebor and beyond. The deep places stirred, the old alliances woke, and in the heart of one young woman, the fire of awakening burned brighter than all the stars. As evening fell over Edoras, and the great muster prepared to ride forth with the dawn, Gandalf sat in the hall of Meduseld, like a figure from the elder tales, his white robes catching the firelight as he spoke of distant lands and deeds that seemed to belong to another age. Around him gathered the lords and captains who would lead Rohan's warriors to Helm's Deep, their faces grave with the weight of the choices that lay before them, yet hungry for whatever hope the wizard's words might bring. "You speak much of armies and alliances," said Éomer, leaning forward in his chair with the restless energy of one who yearned for action, of dwarves in their mountain halls and elves in their hidden realms. But what of the simple folk, the farmers and craftsmen who have no swords to offer, no great deeds to sing? Do they count for nothing in this war of powers? Gandalf smiled then, and in his eyes was a light that spoke of green hills and flowing water, of gardens where flowers bloomed in peace, and the greatest concern was whether the potatoes would be ready for harvest. "My dear Éomer, you ask of the very heart of the matter, for it is precisely for such folk that we fight, not for the glory of kings or the ambition of wizards, but for the right of simple people to live simple lives in peace." From her place among the women of the household, Éowyn listened with growing wonder as the wizard spoke of a land she had never seen, yet somehow knew in her heart. A green country where round doors opened onto gardens bright with flowers, where folk walked barefoot on soft grass and thought the greatest adventure was a journey to the next village. He spoke of the Shire with such tenderness that she could almost smell the scent of pipeweed drifting on the evening air, could almost hear the laughter of children playing beside clear streams. "There dwelt one whom I knew well," Gandalf continued, his voice growing soft with memory. "Bilbo Baggins was his name, and smaller he was than the smallest child here present, yet greater in courage than many who called themselves warriors. When I came to his door in Bag End, for so his home was called, he was content with his books and his garden, his pantry full of good food, and his days ordered in the peaceful rhythm that his people have followed for countless generations." "And yet you took him from this paradise?" asked Theoden, and there was something almost wistful in the king's voice, as if he too yearned for such simplicity. "I offered him an adventure," Gandalf replied, though he thought it nothing more than a mad scheme to trouble his comfortable existence. "But sometimes, my friends, adventure comes whether we seek it or not, and the choice becomes not whether to face danger, but how we face it, with courage or with fear, with hope or with despair. The wizard's staff caught the firelight, and in its crystal head, Éowyn seemed to see visions of that long-ago quest. A small figure in yellow and green, walking beside 13 dwarves on roads that led through dark forests and over snow-capped mountains. She saw him standing before a dragon's hoard, small and trembling, yet somehow finding the words to match wits with Smaug the Terrible. She saw him creeping through goblin tunnels with nothing but a little sword and a magic ring to protect him, yet pressing on when braver hearts might have failed. He found treasures beyond gold on that journey, Gandalf said. He discovered that the fire of courage burns as bright in a hobbit's heart as in the breast of any warrior, that wisdom often wears humble clothes, and that the smallest hand can turn the wheel of fate when the hour of need arrives. When he returned to his beloved Shire, he brought with him more than dwarf gold. He carried the knowledge that even the most peaceful folk have their part to play in the great music of the world. But where is he now? Asked Gamling. Does he prepare his people for war? Do the hobbits take up arms against the darkness? A shadow passed across Gandalf's face, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of sorrow that made the very stones of the hall seem to grieve. Bilbo's day is done. His adventure ended. He has passed beyond the circles of the world, sailing with the elves to lands where no shadow falls. But his heir carries a burden that makes Bilbo's dragon quest seem like a child's game. Even now, Frodo Baggins walks in darkness, bearing a weight that would crush the strongest among us, yet pressing on with the quiet determination that is the greatest gift of his people. Éowyn felt her heart stir at these words, touched by a recognition she could not name. For was she not also walking in darkness, bearing burdens that others deemed too heavy for her shoulders? Was she not also pressed to find courage in herself that others believed she did not possess? The hobbits fight no battles, Gandalf continued, raise no armies, sound no horns of war, yet upon their shoulders rests the fate of all we hold dear. They remind us that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to do what must be done despite that fear. They show us that the mightiest fortress can be brought low by the smallest key, that sometimes the gentlest touch can accomplish what all the strength of armies cannot. The fire crackled in the great hearth, and for a moment the hall was filled with a peace that seemed to flow from green fields and running water, from gardens where simple folk tended their flowers and thought themselves no heroes. Yet, in that peace was a strength greater than steel, a hope that no darkness could wholly quench. Remember this when the horns of war sound tomorrow, Gandalf said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. You ride not for glory or conquest, but to guard the right of hobbits to tend their gardens, of children to play beside clear streams, of ordinary folk to live ordinary lives in peace. There is no higher cause, no greater honor than to stand between the darkness and the light. And Éowyn, listening in the shadows, felt something shift within her heart. Not the fierce fire of battle rage, but something gentler, yet no less strong. She thought of small hands holding great burdens, of quiet courage that asked for no songs or praise, of the truth that heroism came in many forms, and that the smallest deed done with love might shine brighter than all the victories of kings. The hobbits had their part to play. Perhaps she too would find her own path to the light. In the hour before dawn, when mist rose from the river and the stars faded one by one into the grey vault of heaven, the great courtyard of Edoras filled with the ordered chaos of an army preparing to march. 6,000 riders of the mark stood ready, their spears bright in the torchlight, their horses stamping and snorting in the cool air as if they too sensed the magnitude of the day that was dawning. From the stables came the sound of final preparations, the creak of leather as saddles were checked and tightened, the ring of steel as weapons were secured in their sheaths. the low voices of men speaking the words that might be their last to wives and children they would leave behind. In the map room beneath the Golden Hall, where the ancient charts of Rohan lay spread upon tables of carved oak, Theoden King took counsel with his captains one final time before the riding. Candlelight flickered across the yellowed parchments, illuminating the roads and rivers, the hills and valleys that had been the battlegrounds of his people for 5 centuries. Yet tonight, the maps told a different story. Not of past glories, but of present perils that threatened to undo all that the Horse Lords had built. "Here," said Erkenbrand, his weathered finger tracing the line of the river Isen, "my scouts report the main host of Saruman, 10,000 strong, with siege towers and engines of war. They move slowly, but they move surely, and nothing in their path is left alive. The Westfold burns, my lord. By tomorrow's sunset, they will be at the gates of Helm's Deep." Gandalf stood silent at the king's shoulder, his white robe seeming to gather all the light in the chamber. In his hands he held not the maps of Rohan, but letters that had come by swift messenger from distant lands, tidings from Lothlorien and Rivendell, from the halls of the Elrond and the courts of kings whose names were legend. As he read, his face grew grave, yet not with despair, but with the terrible clarity of one who sees all the pieces of a vast game falling into their appointed places. "The Dunedain ride," he said at last, breaking the silence that had fallen over the council. 30 rangers of the north, led by one whose blood carries the heritage of kings. They will come to Gondor's aid, though the path they take leads through shadows deeper than any we have known. From Dol Amroth comes word that Prince Imrahil musters his knights, and the beacons of Gondor will burn upon the hilltops when the hour of greatest need arrives. "And what of Minas Tirith?" asked Éomer, his young face marked by the weight of command that war had thrust upon him. "What word from the City of Kings?" The wizard's expression darkened, and when he spoke, his voice carried echoes of sorrow that seemed to reach back through all the long years of the world's waning. "Denethor rules in Gondor, but madness gnaws at his heart like a worm in the core of a fair apple. He sits in his tower of stone and sees only defeat in every message, only doom in every choice that lies before him. Yet still the walls of Minas Tirith stand strong, and still there are those within who remember their duty to the light." From her place in the shadows beyond the door, for the women of the household were not permitted in the councils of war, though Éowyn had learned the art of listening without being seen, she heard these words with a heart that beat like a war drum in her breast. The pieces of the great game were indeed falling into place, and with each message that arrived, each report from the borders of the known world, she felt the pull of destiny growing stronger. For in the deepest hours of the night, when sleep had fled from her like a startled bird, she had walked in the armory once more and seen visions that seemed to come from no earthly source. She had seen herself standing upon a field of battle where the grass was red with blood and the air rang with the sound of swords, facing an enemy whose very presence was a wound in the world. She had heard her own voice crying words of defiance that echoed across the centuries, felt her blade bite deep into flesh that should have been beyond the reach of mortal steel. Was it prophecy, or merely the fever dream of a mind too long constrained by walls and customs? She could not say, yet the visions burned in her memory with a clarity that spoke of truth, deeper than the surface of waking thought. And in them, always, she wore not the gown of a noblewoman, but the mail and helm of a warrior, her face hidden behind steel, her true name known to none save the wind that carried her war cry across the field. As the council dispersed and the captains went to ready their companies for the road, Éowyn slipped back through the corridors of Medusel to her own chamber, where a plan had been slowly taking shape through the long watches of the night. In the chest beside her bed lay the garments she had gathered piece by piece. A mail shirt that might once have belonged to a young rider of the Eord. Boots of supple leather that would not betray her with the click of heels upon stone. A helm whose nasal and cheek guards would hide the telltale curves of a woman's face. She lifted the mail shirt from its resting place, feeling its weight in her hands, heavier than any gown she had ever worn, yet somehow lighter than the chains of custom that had bound her for so long. The steel rings caught the candlelight, each one a link in the armor that would transform her from captive maiden to free warrior, from Éowyn the White Lady of Rohan to someone whose name she had not yet chosen, but whose deeds would echo through the halls of memory. "Not yet," she whispered to the shadows and the steel. "Not yet, but soon. When the king rides to Dunharrow and thinks me safely hidden among the women and children, when the men of Rohan believe themselves the only guardians of the light, then will the daughter of Éowyn ride forth to find her own path to glory." Outside her window, the first horns of the morning began to sound, calling the riders to their horses and the road that led to Helm's Deep. But she knew, with a certainty that came from no earthly source, that her own road led farther still, to fields of battle where the fate of the world would be decided, where a king might fall and a warrior might rise from the ashes of the old world to kindle the fires of the new. The plan was set, the quest was seeded, and in her heart the flame of awakening burned brighter than the morning star. The sun had not yet climbed above the eastern peaks when the host of Rohan rode forth from Edoras, 6,000 spears gleaming in the pale light of dawn as they took the road to Helm's Deep. From the high terrace of Meduseld, Éowyn watched them go, a river of steel and horsehair flowing westward across the grasslands, their banners streaming in the morning wind like the wings of great birds flying toward the storm. At their head rode Theoden King, straight-backed and proud in his saddle, the white horse of the mark blazing on his green surcoat, and beside him Gandalf the White, terrible and beautiful as winter lightning. But even as her heart swelled with pride to see her people riding to war with such courage, a darkness gathered on the western horizon that spoke of trials beyond the strength of mortal men to bear. Great columns of smoke rose from the direction of Isengard, black against the sky, and the wind that blew from those quarters carried the reek of burning and the distant sound of drums that beat with the rhythm of marching feet. Saruman's hour had come at last, and the fire he had kindled in the deep places of Orthanc was spreading across the world like a plague. As the last riders disappeared into the morning haze, word came by swift messenger from the Westfold, tidings that turned the blood to ice in the veins of all who heard them. Erkenbrand's fortress at the Hornburg was under siege, 10,000 Uruk-hai hammering at its gates, while engines of war hurled great stones against walls that had stood unconquered since the days of Helm Hammerhand. Worse still, other hosts moved in the darkness beyond, orcs from the mountains, wolves from the Iwjete wastes, and creatures whose names were spoken only in whispers, things that served the Dark Lord in his halls of shadow. "The fire spreads," said Harma grimly, reading the dispatch by the light of the torches that still burned in the great hall, not just westward to the Hornburg, but north toward the borders of Lothlorien, south to the crossings of Osgiliath. "The enemy has unmasked himself at last, and all his malice is revealed. This is no longer a war of borders and boundaries, but a battle for the very soul of Middle-earth." From the high windows of the Golden Hall, those who remained behind could see the signs of the awakening conflict written across the dome of heaven. To the south, a red glow flickered on the horizon where fires burned in the night, and strange birds flew overhead. Not the honest ravens and eagles of the mountains, but creatures of shadow whose cries spoke of doom and desolation. The very air seemed charged with malevolent energy, as if the world itself had become a battlefield between forces too vast for mortal minds to comprehend. In her chamber, Éowyn felt the change like a fever in her blood. a restlessness that made every moment of waiting and agony beyond endurance. The visions that had haunted her dreams grew stronger, more vivid, until she could scarce tell where sleep ended and waking began. She saw great cities burning, their towers falling like broken spears. She saw armies of the dead rising from their barrows to march beneath banners that bore no device of the living world. And always, always, she saw herself standing in the midst of battle, her sword bright with the blood of enemies, her voice raised in the war cry of her people. But most clearly of all, she saw a figure clad in shadow and flame, riding upon a winged nightmare across a field of death. In its hand was a blade that seemed forged from darkness itself, and from its hidden face came a cold that could freeze the blood in mortal veins. It was the chieftain of the Nine, the Witch-king of Angmar, herald of despair and captain of the hosts of Mordor. And in her vision it was she who faced him, not the knights of Gondor, not the warriors of Rohan, but Éowyn, daughter of Eowyn, with only her courage and her blade to stand between that ancient evil and the light of the world. "Why these visions?" she whispered to the darkness of her chamber, her hands pressed against the cold stone of the windowsill. "Why do I see what others cannot see? Why does my heart burn with fire that belongs on the battlefield, not in the halls of women?" But even as she spoke the words, she knew the answer. For the blood of kings ran in her veins, the same blood that had driven Eorl the Young to ride south from the distant north, when Gondor called for aid, the same blood that had made her ancestors the terror of their enemies and the hope of their allies. She was not meant to sit idle while others fought for the fate of the world. She was meant to ride beside them, to share their perils and their glory, to prove that the fire of courage burned as bright in a woman's heart as in the breast of any man. As dawn broke over the Pelennor fields, though she knew it not yet, the armies of Mordor began their march toward Minas Tirith, and in the distance the beacons of Gondor blazed to life upon the hilltops, calling for aid that might come too late. In the north, the forces of Dol Guldur stirred from their long slumber, and Lothlorien prepared for siege. In the west, the walls of Helm's Deep shuddered beneath the assault of Saruman's host, and brave men died with songs of defiance on their lips. The fire had awakened indeed, and all the world would feel its burning before the tale was done. But in the heart of one young woman, another fire burned, the fire of awakening destiny, the flame that would carry her beyond the walls of Edoras to fields of battle, where legends would be born and the fate of ages decided. The hour of her choosing drew near, and she would not be found wanting when it came. While Rohan rode to war in the west, far to the south and east a shadow darker than storm clouds gathered above the plains of Mordor. From the Black Gate came the sound of horns that had not blown since the dark years of the Second Age, when Gil-galad and Elendil led the last alliance against the towers of Barad-dûr. Now those same horns sounded again, calling forth legions that made Saruman's host seem like a company of raiders beside the armies of the true darkness. They came forth like a tide of black water spilling from the broken dam of some infernal sea. Orcs beyond counting, trolls from the mountains of shadow, Easterlings with their great mumakiels swaying like moving towers above the ranks of spears. At their head rode the Nine, the Nazgûl in all their terrible majesty, and chief among them the Witch-king of Angmar, whose very presence was a wound in the world that would not heal. Their destination was known to all who had eyes to see. Minas Tirith, the White, last bastion of the kingdoms of men, where Denethor the ruling steward sat in his tower of stone and watched the darkness gather with eyes that saw only despair. In Edoras, word of this great mustering came by ways that owed nothing to horse or hawk. Whispers on the wind, shadows that moved against the light, dreams that came unbidden to those who slept fitfully in the hours before dawn. Éowyn woke from such a dream in the deep of night. her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. In her vision, she had seen the Pelennor fields stretching green and fair beneath the morning sun, and upon them the last battle of the age unfolding like a tapestry, woven from courage and despair. She had seen herself there, not as a vision or a possibility, but as a certainty written in the very fabric of time itself. She stood upon that field with her blade in her hand, and before her loomed the shadow of the one whom no living man could slay, whose very breath was the chill of the grave, and whose voice spoke words that froze the blood in mortal veins. Yet she did not flee, did not falter, but lifted her sword toward the darkening sky, and spoke words that rang across the field like the call of hunting horns. I know not what those words were, she whispered to the darkness of her chamber, pressing her hands to her temples, where the visions still burned like brands of fire. But I know they were mine to speak, mine to carry from this place of waiting to that field of destiny. The blade calls to me, and I can deny it no longer. Rising from her bed, like one moving in a dream that had become more real than waking, she went to the chest, where her preparations lay hidden beneath silks and linens meant for more peaceful days. The mail shirt seemed to sing as she lifted it, each ring catching what little light crept through the shuttered window, and when she slipped it over her head, she felt the weight of it settle upon her shoulders, like the mantle of her true self at last revealed. The sword, her father's sword, Éowyn's blade that had tasted the blood of orcs on a dozen battlefields, came to her hand as if it had been forged for no other purpose than this moment. She drew it from its sheath, and in the darkness of her chamber, the steel seemed to hold a light of its own, pale and clean as starlight on snow. For the first time in her life, she held a real weapon with the right to wield it, and in that moment she ceased to be Eowyn the Caged Maiden and became something new. A warrior whose name was yet to be chosen, but whose deeds would echo through the halls of song. Dernhelm, she spoke aloud, testing the name on her tongue like a key in a lock that had long resisted turning. Dernhelm the young rider, who serves the King of Rohan and asks no questions of any man. It was a simple name, a common name, one that would draw no attention from those who thought they knew all the faces in the king's service. Yet it was hers now, as surely as the sword in her hand and the mail upon her breast. In the stables below, Wynfola waited, her own mare, swift as the wind of the mark, and trained to answer her lightest touch. She had prepared the horse in secret over many nights, accustoming her to the weight of mail and the presence of steel, teaching her to stand steady when swords were drawn, and to respond to commands given in a voice disguised by the enclosed helm of a warrior. Now, as she made her way through the silent corridors of Meduseld, she could hear the mare's soft whicker of greeting, as if even the horse understood that this night was different from all others. The guards at the gates knew her well enough to let her pass. They had grown accustomed to her restless wanderings in the hours when sleep fled from the golden hall like a startled bird. But tonight she did not walk in the gardens or pace the walls in maiden's gown and slippers. Tonight she rode out into the darkness clad in steel and purpose, her true face hidden behind the nasal and cheek guards of her helm, her woman's voice muffled to the gruff tones of a young rider who might serve any lord of the mark. Behind her, Edoras slept in the embrace of its ancient stones, unconscious of the transformation that had taken place within its walls. Before her stretched the roads of Middle-earth, dark and perilous, yet bright with the promise of deeds that would be sung of when the last of the golden halls had crumbled to dust and the wind of the grasslands blew over forgotten graves. She did not know where those roads would lead her, whether to Helm's Deep where her uncle fought against Saruman's host, or to some other field where the forces of light and shadow would meet in final battle. But she knew, with a certainty that came from the deepest wells of her being, that she would ride them as herself at last, not as a reflection of others' expectations, but as the warrior she had always been meant to be. The blade was drawn, the quest begun, and Dernhelm rode forth into the night, seeking the destiny that called to her from across the darkness of the world. 3 days' hard riding brought Dernhelm to the Gap of Rohan, where the road from Edoras met the ancient track that wound between the mountains toward the western sea. Here, in a hollow shielded from the wind by standing stones that remembered the elder days, she came upon a sight that filled her heart with fierce joy. The banners of Rohan streaming in the morning light, 6,000 spears glinting like stars as the host of the Mark rode eastward from their victory at Helm's Deep. The fortress of the Hornburg stood intact behind them, its white walls unmarked by fire, its gates thrown wide to let the morning sun stream into courtyards that had run red with orc blood through the dark hours of the night. Saruman's host was broken, his Uruk-hai slain or scattered, his dreams of conquest reduced to ash and carrion that bed the ravens of the Westfold. Yet there was no celebration in the ranks of the riders, no songs of triumph echoing across the grasslands, for all knew that this victory, great though it was, served only to clear the path for a greater struggle that awaited them in the east. From her vantage point upon a hilltop crowned with ancient barrows, Dernhelm watched as the column passed below, Theoden King at its head, straight-backed and proud despite the weariness that marked his weathered features, and beside him Gandalf the White, his robes catching the light like snow on distant peaks. Behind them rode the flower of Rohan's youth, Ioma with his golden hair streaming like a banner, Garmling and Hama, and all the captains whose names were written in the songs of their people. Yet for all their courage and skill, she could see the shadow that lay upon their spirits, the knowledge that they rode toward a darkness greater than any they had yet faced. "The beacons burn," she heard one rider say to his companion as they passed beneath her hiding place. From Amon Din to Min Rimmon, from Calenhad to the Halifirion, the signal fires call Rohan to honor the ancient oath. Gondor has need of us, and we must answer, though it lead us into the very jaws of death. "Aye," replied his fellow, shifting his spear to his shield hand as he spoke. "But what aid can 6,000 bring against the hosts that march from Mordor? They say the armies of the Dark Lord number in the hundreds of thousands, orcs and trolls and creatures of shadow that have no names in the tongues of free folk. We ride to our doom, and all our courage cannot change that harsh arithmetic." Yet, as the riders passed, Dernhelm heard other voices rising among them. Younger voices that spoke not of doom, but of the deeds their fathers had wrought in darker hours, of the charge of Eorl at the field of Celebrant, of the countless times when the riders of the Mark had turned the tide of battle when all seemed lost. And in their words she heard the true strength of her people, not in their numbers or their weapons, but in their refusal to despair, their willingness to ride toward the light even when the darkness seemed overwhelming. When the last rider had passed and the dust of their passage had settled upon the ancient stones, Dernhelm urged Windfuller down from the hilltop and fell in behind the column. One more spear among the thousands, one more rider whose face was hidden beneath helm and nasal guard. None questioned her presence. In the aftermath of victory and the urgency of the road ahead, there was no time to count faces or challenge strangers who wore the colors of the Mark. Yet as she rode among them, listening to their talk of battles past and perils to come, she felt the weight of knowledge that none of them shared. For in her visions she had seen the field where their true test waited, the Pelennor, green and fair beneath the walls of Minas Tirith, where the fate of the world would be decided in a single day of battle. She had seen the armies of Mordor spreading across those fields like a black tide, and at their head the 9 riders in all their terrible majesty, bringing despair and the chill of the grave to all who stood against them. Most clearly of all, she had seen her own part in that battle, the moment when all hope seemed lost and the darkness pressed close about the forces of the light, when even the bravest hearts began to fail and the songs of victory died upon the lips of those who sang them. In that hour, when the Witch-king of Angmar rode forth to claim his prey, and no warrior of men dared stand against his ancient malice, she would be there. Not as Éowyn of Rohan, trapped by the conventions of her birth and station, but as Dernhelm the rider, free to choose her own path to glory or death. The thought should have filled her with fear, for what was one sword against the captain of the Nine, one mortal voice against the power that had haunted Middle-earth since the dark years of the Second Age. Yet, as she rode among her people, toward the destiny that awaited them all, she felt only a strange peace settling upon her spirit. The peace of one who has found her true place in the great song of the world at last. Behind them, the Hornburg stood free, Saruman's threat broken upon its ancient walls. Before them lay the road to Minas Tirith, where greater perils waited, but also the chance for deeds that would echo through all the ages yet to come. And somewhere in that bright darkness ahead, where courage would be tested and legends born, Dernhelm would find the battlefield where her blade could serve the light, not as a woman constrained by others' expectations, but as a warrior whose strength came not from her birth or station, but from the fire that burned within her heart. The kingdom of Rohan was reclaimed, its enemies scattered before the wrath of the Horse Lords. But the greater kingdom, the realm of freedom itself, still hung in the balance, and its salvation would require sacrifices that few could imagine, and fewer still could make. Yet some there were who would not count the cost too high, if the price of their courage was the preservation of all they held dear. As the host of Rohan rode eastward through the gathering dusk, following paths that had carried their fathers to victory at the field of Celebrant, a restlessness moved through the ranks that had little to do with the weariness of long roads or the anticipation of battle. Horses shied at shadows that held nothing more than wind, and even the most seasoned warriors found their sleep troubled by dreams that slipped away with the dawn, yet left behind a sense of urgency that gnawed at the edges of consciousness, like hunger that no food could satisfy. Dernhelm felt it too, a pulling in her heart toward the south and east, as if some great weight had shifted in the deep places of the world and sent ripples through the very fabric of time itself. In the quiet hours when the column rested and the guards changed their watch, she would stand apart from the others and turn her face toward the distant peaks of the Ephel Duath, feeling drawn by something she could not name, yet dared not ignore. There was a voice in the wind that spoke no words any living tongue could understand, yet its meaning was clear as the ring of steel on steel. "Hurry," it whispered. "Hurry, for the hour grows late and the shadow lengthens across the world." Gandalf felt it most of all. The wizard rode at the head of the column like a figure wrought from winter storm, his white robes billowing in the wind and his eyes fixed upon horizons that only he could see. Sometimes he would halt without warning, his head tilted as if he listened to sounds that came from no earthly source, and in those moments the very air around him seemed to crackle with the tension of great forces straining against bonds that grew weaker with each passing hour. "What troubles you, Mithrandir?" asked Theoden one evening as they camped beside the ruins of an ancient watchtower, its stones black with the passage of countless years. "Victory was ours at the Hornburg, and our road lies clear before us. Yet you wear the look of one who sees storm clouds gathering where others see only starlight." The wizard turned his piercing gaze upon the king, and in his eyes was a shadow deeper than the darkness that pooled between the standing stones. "The ring moves, Theoden King," he said quietly, his words carried away by the wind as soon as they were spoken. "Hidden still, yes, and guarded by courage greater than that of any warrior who has ever drawn sword in defense of the light. Yet it cannot remain secret much longer. Its power calls to its master across the leagues, and with each step that brings it closer to its destination, The very foundations of the world tremble with the weight of what it bears. Around the scattered fires of the camp, men spoke in hushed voices of strange dreams that had visited them in the watches of the night. Visions of a great eye opening in the eastern darkness, of towers falling like wheat before the scythe, of voices calling from distant lands in languages that belonged to no living people. Some had dreamed of vast armies marching across fields of ash, while others spoke of eagles flying overhead and bears stirring in their mountain lairs, as if all the creatures of Middle-earth had heard some summons that mortal ears could not detect. But strangest of all were the dreams that came to those who bore no burden of command, who carried no great weapons of legend or heirloom of kings. Dernhelm had such a dream on the second night after joining the column, and woke with tears upon her cheeks and a song upon her lips that she did not remember learning. In her vision she had seen two small figures climbing a path that wound upward through a landscape of shadow and flame, their faces hidden by hoods and cloaks, yet their courage burning like beacons in the darkness that surrounded them. One leaned heavily upon his companion, as if some great weight pressed upon his shoulders, while the other guided his steps with the patience of one who has chosen to share another's burden, though it lead to the very edge of doom. Behind them crept a third figure, pale and wasted, yet driven by a hunger that made him more dangerous than any wolf. His eyes reflected the fire of the mountain toward which they climbed, and in his whispered words was a madness that spoke of obsession older than the kingdoms of men, older even than the trees of Fangorn or the stones of Khazad-dûm. "My precious," she heard him whisper in her dream, the words slithering through her mind like serpents. So close now, so close to the fire where it was made. But not for them, no, not for the thieves and tricksters who stole it from us. Ours it was, ours by right, and ours it shall be again when the mountain takes them and burns, their flesh to ash and their bones to dust. Yet even as the creature spoke his words of malice, Dernhelm could see the truth that he himself was blind to, that his role in the great song was not that of destroyer, but of catalyst, that his very treachery would serve the purposes of the light in ways that no planning or wisdom could achieve. For there are currents in the music of creation that run deeper than the intentions of any single heart, and sometimes the darkest notes serve to make the final harmony all the more beautiful. She woke from the dream with the certainty that somewhere in the shadow of Mount Doom, the fate of the world was being decided by choices that would never be recorded in the songs of men, by sacrifices that would never be counted among the great deeds of kings. And she knew, with a clarity that came from no earthly source, that her own parts in the song was bound to theirs, that the blade she would wield upon the Pelennor fields drew its true strength not from the steel of its forging, but from the courage of small hands carrying impossible burdens in the darkness of the world. The ring slept still, hidden in the folds of Frodo's cloak as he climbed the paths of shadow toward the Sammath Nor. But its dreams were the dreams of all Middle-earth now, and in them the fate of ages turned upon the choices of the humble and the brave, the forgotten and the scorned, all those who had been counted too small to change the world, yet who would prove in the end that the smallest flame can kindle the greatest fire. Dernhelm rode on through the night, her hand resting on the hilt of her father's sword, and in her heart the flame of destiny burned brighter than the stars. On the 5th day of their eastward journey, when the towers of Minas Tirith should have been visible like white spears against the morning sky, the host of Rohan came instead upon a sight that chilled the blood in their veins and spoke of perils beyond the strength of mortal arms to overcome. Where the great city should have stood proud and defiant above the Pelennor fields, a darkness hung like a pall of storm clouds that no wind could drive away, and from within that shadow came sounds that belonged to no wholesome place. The clash of arms, the cries of men in desperate battle, and beneath it all, a drumming that seemed to echo from the very foundations of the earth. The Ramaz Ekor, the great wall that girdled the fertile fields around the city, lay broken in a dozen places, its stones scattered like the bones of some vast creature slain by powers too terrible to name. Through the gaps in that ancient barrier poured streams of darkness, not merely the absence of light, but a malevolent force that seemed to devour hope itself wherever it touched. Orcs beyond counting moved in those black rivers, and with them creatures of shadow that had no fixed shape, things that shifted and writhed like smoke, given malevolent purpose. Yet it was not the armies of Mordor that brought the deepest chill to the hearts of the watching Rohirrim. It was the knowledge that their enemy had chosen not to meet them in the field, but to withdraw behind the walls of Minas Tirith, like a spider drawing its prey into a web from which there could be no escape. For the darkness that surrounded the city was not merely a siege. It was a trap, a snare laid with careful malice to draw all the forces of the West into one place where they could be destroyed utterly. "They do not flee from us," said Gandalf, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed ranks, though he spoke no louder than a whisper. "This is not retreat, but strategy, the final gambit of one who has had long years to plan this hour. The enemy draws us forward because he knows that we cannot abandon the city, cannot turn aside while Minas Tirith burns. And so we will come to him as he always intended, and on ground of his choosing, we will make our stand." From her place among the riders, Dernhelm watched as the wizard's words settled upon the host like the shadow of great wings. She could see the doubt creeping into faces that had been bright with courage only moments before, could hear it in the voices of men who spoke in hushed tones of the overwhelming odds they faced. Some spoke of turning back, of gathering more allies before attempting to breach that wall of darkness. Others urged an immediate assault, arguing that delay would only give the enemy time to strengthen his position. But Theoden King sat his horse in silence, his weathered hands resting on the pommel of his sword as he studied the darkness that had swallowed the greatest city of Gondor. And in his eyes, Dernhelm saw not fear or doubt, but the same flame that had driven his ancestors to ride across half the world when duty called. The flame that would not be quenched by any shadow, however deep. "We ride," he said at last, his voice carrying the authority of 5 centuries of kingship. "Not because we are certain of victory, but because victory is meaningless if purchased at the cost of abandoning those who trust in our aid." The beacons called, and we answered. Gondor will not fall while horses run and spears can be lifted in the defense of the light. A great shout rose from the assembled riders, not the wild cry of warriors eager for battle, but something deeper and more solemn, the voice of a people who had chosen to stand against the darkness, even knowing that they rode toward their doom. And as that cry echoed across the empty fields, something stirred in the shadow that surrounded Minas Tirith. A ripple of movement, as if the very darkness had turned to watch them with eyes that burned like coals in the night. For a moment, the black clouds parted, and through the gap came a sight that would haunt the dreams of all who witnessed it. A figure mounted upon a fell beast, whose wings blotted out the stars, its rider cloaked in shadow, yet crowned with a circlet of iron that caught no light from any wholesome source. The Witch-king of Angmar had come forth to see what manner of fools would dare challenge the might of Mordor, and in his hidden gaze was a malice so pure and cold that strong men wept to feel its touch. Yet, as Dernhelm looked upon that figure of ancient evil, she felt not despair, but a strange exultation. For here was the enemy she had seen in her visions, the foe she had been born to face. The moment of destiny approached at last, and she would meet it not as a victim, but as a warrior who had chosen her own path to glory. The blade at her side seemed to sing in its sheath, eager for the battle that would test whether the fire that burned in a woman's heart could match the cold malice of the grave. The Witch-king raised his weapon, a blade that seemed forged from darkness itself, and his voice rang across the fields like the tolling of funeral bells. "Turn back, little king," he called, and his words carried the chill of winter and the finality of death. "Turn back, and I may yet grant you a swift end. Come forward, and you will learn what it means to face the servants of the true Lord of Middle-earth." But Theoden's only answer was to spur his horse forward, and behind him rode the 6,000 spears of Rohan, their battle cry ringing across the Pelennor fields like the sound of hunting horns in the morning of the world. The enemy had withdrawn behind his walls of shadow, thinking to trap them in a snare of his own devising. But sometimes the prey proves more dangerous than the hunter expects, and sometimes the light burns brightest in the deepest darkness. The battle for the fate of Middle-earth was about to begin, and at its heart would stand a young warrior, whose true name none suspected, whose courage would prove that the smallest flame can kindle the greatest fire, whose blade would write the final verse in a song that had begun with the first rising of the sun. Dernhelm rode toward her destiny, and the darkness trembled before her coming. In the annals of the Red Book, when the long tale of the War of the Ring was set down by hands wiser than those that wielded swords in its fighting, it was written that the darkness was great in those days, and that hope seemed but a candle flame guttering in a hurricane of malice. Yet for all the vast armies that marched beneath the banners of shadow, for all the ancient powers that stirred in the deep places of the world, the fate of ages turned not upon the clash of hosts or the strategies of kings, but upon choices made by hearts that beat no louder than sparrows' wings, by hands that could scarce span a sword hilt, by voices that had never been raised in the councils of the mighty. So it was that Frodo the halfling bore the burden of the ring through paths of fire and shadow, his small feet treading roads that had broken the will of warriors and kings. So it was that Samwise Gamgee carried his master when strength failed, asking no reward save the right to share the darkness that threatened to claim them both. And so it was that Éowyn, daughter of Éowyn, in the hour when all seemed lost, and the very light of heaven grew dim, cast aside the gilded cage of her birth, and rode forth as Dernhelm the Unknown, seeking not glory, but the chance to stand between the darkness and the dawn. The wise of Middle-earth had long debated the nature of courage, whether it dwelt in the strength of arm or the keenness of blade, in the knowledge of law or the heritage of kings. Yet in the end, when the final songs were sung and the last chronicles written, it was seen that courage was simpler and rarer than any had supposed. It was the choice to continue when continuation seemed impossible, to kindle light when all the world lay wrapped in shadow, to speak hope when only despair seemed wise. Such courage dwelt not in the great halls of kings, though kings might possess it, nor in the towers of wizards, though wizards might wield it with their arts. It lived instead in the quiet places of the heart, where small flames burned with a light that could not be quenched by any wind that blew from the darkness of the world. It was the fire that warmed the hearths of the Shire when the Nazgul rode abroad, the flame that guided lost travellers home through the wildest night, the spark that kindled in the breast of a young woman when she looked upon injustice and found she could not turn away. The roads that led from the Golden Hall of Idoras to the Pelennor fields were long and dark, winding through valleys where ancient evil stirred, and over hills where the bones of heroes lay beneath mounds that remembered no names. Yet they were but part of a longer road still, one that began in the first music of creation and would not end until the last star guttered out in the waste of years. All who walked in Middle-earth trod some portion of that endless path, whether they knew it or not, and the steps they took echoed through the halls of time, long after their feet had turned to dust. Some walked in sunlight, their way made easy by the love of their people and the blessing of their birth. Others stumbled through shadow, carrying burdens that would have crushed spirits less determined than their own. A few, the blessed or the cursed, depending upon how one viewed such things, were granted the gift of seeing clearly where their path must lead, of understanding that their choices would ripple through the ages like stones cast into still water. Dernhelm was such a one. In the deeps of her captivity, when the walls of Meduseld seemed like the boundaries of the world itself, she had felt the pull of that longer road calling to her across the leagues. Through vision and dream, through the whispers of wind and the testimony of her own awakening heart, she had come to understand that her fate was bound to powers greater than kingdoms, to choices that would echo through generations yet unborn. Now, as she rode with the host of Rohan toward the darkness that surrounded Minas Tirith, that understanding burned within her like a forge fire. She was no longer the maiden who had paced the halls of Edoras in bitter frustration, dreaming of deeds that seemed forever beyond her reach. She was no longer even Éowyn of the Mark, bound by the expectations of birth and blood. She was Dernhelm the Rider, whose name was known to none save the wind, but whose deeds would be sung when the children of men had learned to fly among the stars. The quiet fire that had kindled in her heart when first she defied the voice of despair had grown with each step of her journey, fed by the courage of hobbits and the wisdom of wizards, by the loyalty of servants and the love of horses, by all the small graces that made life worth defending against the vast malice of the shadow. It was not the wild flame of battle fury that burned within her now, but something steadier and more enduring, the light that dwells in hearts that have chosen hope over fear, duty over desire, love over the safety of isolation. Behind her lay the ashes of the life she had been meant to live, the comfortable captivity of the Golden Hall, the marriage that would have bound her to some worthy lord, the children who would have carried her blood, but not her fire into the future. Before her stretched the unknown country where legends were born and heroes fell, where the price of victory was measured not in gold or glory, but in the willingness to stand when standing seemed impossible, to fight when fighting seemed futile, to hope when hope seemed the province of fools. She did not know, as she rode through the gathering darkness toward the field where her destiny waited, that her name would echo through the ages as the one who broke the power of the Witch-king. She did not know that her blade would write the final verse in a song that had begun with the first defiance of the darkness in the elder days. She knew only that the small hands that gripped her reins had been given strength enough for the task that lay before them, that the quiet fire within her heart burned bright enough to light the way through whatever shadows might come. In the end, it was enough. In the end, it was more than enough. For the light that kindled in one determined heart could spread to kindle others, and from such small flames, the great bonfires of renewal were lit. The darkness was vast and the shadow deep, but it had no power over those who chose to carry their own light into the places where hope seemed lost. The dawn was coming, though none who rode beneath the banner of the White Horse could yet see its promise. But Dernhelm rode toward it with a heart full of fire and a blade bright with purpose, and in her riding was the hope of all the world made manifest. Small hands carrying great burdens, quiet fires burning bright against the night, and the endless courage of those who choose to stand when others fall. The long road led forward, and she would walk it to the end.